the most haunted street in Victorian London. A complete cinematic script, Blackthorn Alley, Whitechapel, 1888. Sound, distant church bell tolling midnight, rain on cobblestones, a lone horse-drawn carriage fading into fog. There are streets in London that the maps refuse to name, streets where even the fog seems afraid to linger. Tonight we walk one such street. Pull your coat tighter, stay close to the lamplight, and whatever you hear in the shadows ahead, do not stop walking. Chapter 1. The street nobody walks at night. Sound, wet cobblestones underfoot, gas lamp hissing, wind threading through broken shutters. They call it Blackthorn Alley. It has no sign. The city forgot to give it one, or perhaps chose to forget. It runs for exactly 114 yards between Osborne Street and a wall that shouldn't exist. A wall that appears on no city plan, built from black stone that never quite dries no matter how long the sun burns above it. The residents of Whitechapel will tell you many things about Blackthorn Alley if you catch them in the right mood, which is to say, in daylight and in company. They will tell you about the sounds, the whispering, a voice that seems to come from inside the very brick, low and steady, like a man reading to himself in an empty room. They will tell you that no dog will enter the alley after dark, that the gas lamps at either end burn yellow everywhere else in Whitechapel, but here, on this particular stretch, they burn white. And they will tell you about the autumn of 1888, when the streets of London learned what it meant to be truly afraid. Whitechapel in 1888 was not a place for the faint-hearted under any circumstances. It was London's open wound, a district of 12,000 souls crammed into courts and rookeries, where 6 families shared a single room, where cholera moved quietly from building to building like an uninvited lodger, where children sold matches in the rain and old men died of the cold before anyone thought to check on them. The Thames fog rolled in from the east every evening and did not lift until well past dawn, and in that fog anything could happen, and frequently did. But Blackthorn Alley was different. Even the criminals avoided it. The thieves and footpads and confidence men who worked the surrounding streets gave it a wide berth. There was an understanding among the criminal population of Whitechapel, unspoken, never written down, never formally agreed upon, that Blackthorn Alley was not territory that could be claimed. It belonged to something else, something that had been there before any of them and would be there long after. The alley had a history that the official records preferred to ignore. In 1842, 4 residents of the tenement at number 7 had died in a single night, cause undetermined. In 1857, a policeman named Constable Webb had entered the alley in pursuit of a suspected pickpocket and emerged 40 minutes later without the pickpocket, without his notebook, and without any memory of what had happened during those 40 minutes. He resigned from the force the following week. He never spoke publicly about that night, but his daughter, interviewed 50 years later, said that her father had woken screaming every night for the rest of his life. And in 1888, something woke up on Blackthorn Alley, something that had perhaps been sleeping for a long time, something that was very, very hungry. Sound, a whisper just beneath the threshold of hearing. The lamp flickers once. At the far end of the alley, beneath the white lamp, something is standing still. You squint through the fog. Whatever it is not moving, but it is watching. Chapter 2. The woman beneath the gas lamp. Sound, rain intensifying. A single sob barely audible, the creak of a sign above a shuttered shop. Her name, according to 3 separate residents of Whitechapel who have all spoken of her in whispers, is or was Eleanor. She wears mourning black. She stands beneath the lamp at the western mouth of Blackthorn Alley every night between the hours of 11 and midnight, and she cries. Not loudly, not dramatically. She cries the way a woman cries when she no longer believes anyone can hear her. Thomas Farrow, a night watchman of 7 years' service along this stretch of Whitechapel, first saw her in September of 1888. He approached. He called out to her. She did not turn. He stepped closer, close enough to see that her black dress was utterly dry despite the pouring rain, and then the lamp flickered once, and she was gone. Not walked away, not stepped back into shadow. Gone, as if she had been a page torn from a book that no longer existed. Farrow reported the incident to the Metropolitan Police. The officer on duty wrote weather-related disturbance in the logbook and returned to his tea. But Farrow had noticed something in that brief moment before she vanished, something that kept him from ever walking that route again. She had no shadow. The gas lamp above her burned white and strong. Every object on that street, the iron post, the curb stone, the puddles of rainwater, cast a shadow. But Alina stood in a circle of light and cast nothing onto the ground beneath her. The cobblestones where her shadow should have been were smooth and bare and perfectly dark. Other residents came forward quietly once word spread. A laundress named Mrs. Hodge had seen Alina on 3 consecutive nights in October. A young boy of 9, son of a rag-and-bone man whose cart passed the alley each evening, claimed he had tried to speak to Alina through the alley's iron railing and that she had turned to look at him. He would not say what her face looked like. He refused. He simply sat very still when pressed, and after a long pause said, she was looking for something she lost. And she was angry that she hadn't found it yet. The police, when eventually shown a description of Alina, searched their missing persons records. They found a match almost immediately. A woman named Alina Marsh, seamstress of Flower and Dean Street, reported missing on the 2nd of September, 1888. The officer who had taken the original report had noted, almost as an afterthought, that Alina Marsh had last been seen entering Blackthorn Alley. She had not been seen leaving it. Sound footsteps stop. The crying resumes, closer now. That night, a woman matching Alina's description was recorded in the police missing persons ledger. The date of her disappearance, September 2nd, 1888. The date Farrow saw her, October 14th, 1888, 6 weeks after she had already vanished. Chapter 3. The First Body Returns. Sound iron gate grinding open, mud beneath boots, distant thunder rolling over the Thames. On the morning of November 3rd, a gravedigger at St. Mary Matfelin churchyard made a discovery that he would describe, to every person willing to listen for the rest of his life, as the wrongest thing God ever permitted. The grave of one Agnes Morrow, buried 6 months prior, a victim whose name had briefly appeared in connection with the Whitechapel murders before the inquest quietly dropped her case, had been disturbed. The soil was broken, the headstone cracked, and the coffin, when the gravedigger summoned the courage to look, was empty. Agnes Morrow was found 2 days later, in Blackthorn Alley, seated against the black wall, dressed in the same burial clothes she had been interred in, still clean, still pressed, as if she had never been put in the ground at all. She showed signs of the original wounds. She also showed signs of something else, markings on both palms, carved with what the examining surgeon described as a remarkably fine blade with evident surgical knowledge. The markings formed a symbol, one the surgeon had never seen before, one that, within the week, would be found carved into the brickwork of 3 separate buildings lining Blackthorn Alley. The police ruled it a distasteful hoax, a sick theatrical gesture from person or persons unknown. The file was closed, but the gravedigger who first found the empty coffin noticed something he did not include in his official statement, something he kept to himself for 20 years before finally writing it down in a letter to his grandson. The soil above Agnes Morrow's grave had not been disturbed from above. The earth had not been dug up from the surface. It had been pushed up from below. Whatever had opened that coffin had done so from the inside. Sound, a single crow calling once from an unseen rooftop, then silence. That same evening, the symbols appeared on a 4th wall. This one had not been there at noon. Someone had carved it in broad daylight on a well-traveled street, and no one had seen them do it. Chapter 4. The Butcher's Symbol. Sound, chisel on stone, slow, rhythmic, then stopping abruptly as if the carver heard something behind them. Inspector Raymond Croft of the Metropolitan Police was not, by nature, a superstitious man. He had worked the streets of Whitechapel for 11 years. He had seen poverty and violence enough to fill a dozen careers, and he had learned long ago to explain the inexplicable by looking for the most practical answer first. Usually, the most practical answer was correct. The symbol was beginning to trouble him. It appeared on buildings only within 100 yards of Blackthorn Alley, never further. It was carved at eye level, always in a single session. The stroke marks confirmed this, and always with the same instrument. A blade approximately 3 millimeters wide, kept at a consistent angle, moved with the confidence of long practice. Whoever was making the carvings was not doing so for the first time. They had carved this symbol before, many times, in other places perhaps. Places Croft hadn't yet found. He brought in a scholar from the British Museum, a man named Dr. Aldous Vane, who specialized in esoteric history. Vane looked at the symbol for a long time without speaking. He asked for a glass of water. He drank it. Then he said, quietly, that the symbol had not been seen in any verified context for approximately 140 years, and that the last documented use of it had been in records connected to a private society that had operated in London during the 1740s. A society that had, in Vane's measured academic phrasing, pursued certain inquiries into the nature of mortality that fell considerably outside the bounds of accepted science or theology. Croft asked what that meant in plain English. Vane said they were trying to reverse death. Not metaphorically, not philosophically. They believed, based on a combination of surgical experimentation and ritual practice drawn from sources Vane declined to specify in a police station, that the membrane between life and death could be weakened in a particular location by performing certain acts at regular intervals over a sustained period, that a place could be prepared, like soil prepared for planting. Croft asked what would be planted. Vane picked up his hat and said he was needed elsewhere, and left without answering. That night Croft walked Blackthorn Alley alone. He was not afraid. He was, he told himself, simply being thorough. He walked the full 114 yards. He counted every symbol. There were now 11. He noted their positions, and at the eastern end, where the black wall rose 20 feet with no door and no window and no obvious reason to exist, he placed his hand flat against the stone. It was warm. Not sun-warmed, not the retained heat of a building with a furnace on the other side. Warm the way living skin is warm, the way a sleeping animal is warm. Croft withdrew his hand. He walked back to the street. He never returned to Blackthorn Alley again, and he retired from the Metropolitan Police 4 months later on grounds of ill health, a description he did not elaborate upon. Sound, the warm stone breathing, very slowly in the dark. Chapter 5, The Underground Doctor. Sound, dripping water, the echo of footsteps in a low tunnel, somewhere ahead the faint sound of glass instruments. His name was Dr. Silas Pruett, and he had once been one of the most promising surgeons in London. He had trained at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He had published 3 well-regarded papers on surgical technique. He had been, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary precision and considerable promise. And then, in 1881, something had happened that his colleagues were reluctant to discuss. A patient had died on the table, not unusual, not in an era when surgical mortality was common, but Pruett's response to the death had been, as one of his former colleagues put it, not that of a man experiencing grief, but of a man experiencing fascination. He was quietly removed from his hospital post. He did not contest the decision. He simply disappeared. He reappeared in Whitechapel, in a room beneath a building on Old Montague Street, a room accessed through a trapdoor beneath a false floor in a room that appeared, from street level, to be an ordinary chandler's shop. The chandler, a man named Dobbs, received regular payments from Pruett in exchange for his silence. Dobbs kept his silence until 1889, when he took severely ill and, believing himself to be dying, confessed everything to a local vicar. He did not, in fact, die. He made a full recovery, which he attributed to divine mercy, but by then the vicar had already notified the authorities. What they found in Pruett's underground room was documented in a sealed report that has never been fully made public. What can be said is this: Pruett had been practicing surgery underground for 7 years. His patient records meticulous, obsessive, written in a hand that had grown steadily more erratic over the years, indicated dozens of procedures performed. Many of the patients had not survived. Some had not been patients in any conventional sense. Some were connected through names and dates that investigators cross-referenced with police missing persons files to the Whitechapel murders. Pruett had been collecting, preserving, studying. But what troubled the investigators most was not the bodies, nor the instruments, nor the jars of preserved material that lined the shelves like a grotesque library. What troubled them most was the operating table itself. It was positioned directly beneath a chalk drawing on the stone floor, a drawing of the symbol from Blackthorn Alley, enlarged to fill the entire room. And the table was not simply a surgical table. It had been modified over years of careful adjustment to align the patient's body at a precise angle. The angle, when a mathematician was later consulted, corresponded exactly to a line pointing toward the eastern wall of Blackthorn Alley. The warm wall. Pruett himself was never found. The room was sealed. The report was classified. The Chandler Dobbs moved to Bristol and refused to speak of it for the remainder of his life. Sound, a single instrument, glass against glass, in an empty room that should have no one in it. Chapter 6. Voices inside the walls. Sound, silence. Then, faint and impossible, the sound of breathing from behind a plaster wall. Then screaming, very distant as if from far below. By December of 1888, the residents of the buildings directly bordering Blackthorn Alley had begun to leave. They left quietly, without drama. They did not always explain their reasons, but the reasons were not hard to infer. Mrs. Clara Petch of number 14 Osborne Street, whose bedroom shared a wall with the alley, told the landlord only that she could no longer sleep. She had lived there for 9 years. She left her furniture. She left her china. She left the photograph of her late husband that had hung above the fireplace since the year of his death. She took only her coat and her daughter, and she walked out and did not look back. Others reported the same thing. Not the whispers from the street, those were known. Those were part of life on Blackthorn Alley, almost unremarkable by now. These were something different. These were sounds from inside the walls of the buildings themselves. A low scratching, rhythmic, like fingernails drawn slowly across brick. Voices, indistinct, cycling through the same patterns of sound as if reciting something by rote. And on certain nights, always between 2 and 3 in the morning, always in the coldest part of the winter darkness, screaming. Not one voice, multiple voices, layered, overlapping, building and collapsing like a wave. A structural surveyor was hired by the building's owner to investigate potential issues with the foundations. The surveyor spent 40 minutes in the basement of number 14 before emerging pale and shaking and informing the building's owner, in very direct language, that whatever was happening in the foundations of that building had nothing to do with structural engineering, and that the owner should consider himself fortunate to have the option of selling. The survey report noted, as a professional observation, that the basement walls appeared to have been struck repeatedly from the other side over a very long period of time. The plaster was fractured in layered patterns consistent with decades of impact. Something had been hitting those walls from within for years. Possibly longer. Sound, the scratching starts again, slow, patient, as if whatever is doing it has nowhere else to be. Chapter 7. The Red Ledger. Sound, pages turning in a dark room, a single candle guttering in a draft from an unknown source. On the 14th of December, a bookseller named Francis Quill found something inside a crate of second-hand volumes he had purchased at an estate sale in Stepney. The estate had belonged to a man named Bartholomew Cross, recently deceased, a retired civil servant of no apparent distinction. The crate contained perhaps 40 books, sermons, travel narratives, a complete set of Dickens, and at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a black ribbon, a ledger bound in red leather. Quill, a man of natural curiosity, opened it. The handwriting inside was small and consistent and deeply disturbing. The ledger contained names, dates, addresses, detailed descriptions of locations in Whitechapel, and next to each entry in a separate column, a date that in several cases had not yet arrived. Quill, no fool, recognized some of the names from the newspapers. 3 of them were victims of the Whitechapel murders. Their deaths were recorded in the ledger with clinical precision, the address, the date, the method, and in each case the entry had been made in the same ink, the same hand, as everything around it. These were not additions. They had been written at the same time as the rest of the ledger. They had been written before the murders occurred. The remaining entries, the ones with future dates, numbered 7. Quill went to the police. The ledger was taken into evidence. 2 of the predicted entries passed without incident. The third, a name, an address on Galston Street, a date in late January, was checked in advance by an officer who had taken the matter seriously enough to assign a constable to observe the address on the relevant night. The constable was found the following morning, unconscious in the alley behind the building. He had no memory of the previous 6 hours. He had no injuries, but his uniform, when examined, was found to carry traces of a substance the police surgeon identified as blood, not his own. The woman at the Galston Street address had vanished overnight. She was never found. The ledger was sealed, along with the case. The remaining 4 entries were never publicly verified. The ledger itself is recorded in the Metropolitan Police Archive as having been destroyed in a fire in 1893. The archive shows no evidence of such a fire having occurred. Sound, a book closing, a ribbon being tied, oilcloth crackling in the dark. Chapter 8, The Theater of Shadows. Sound, a string quartet playing something that sounds almost like a waltz. Almost. The tempo is wrong, and one instrument is slightly, badly out of tune. The Craven Theatre had been closed since 1879, when its owner, a man named Gerald Ashe, impresario and sometime fraudster, had absconded with the proceeds of an investment scheme, and was later found drowned in the Regent's Canal under circumstances the coroner struggled to classify as either accidental or deliberate. The theater sat on a narrow street 200 yards north of Blackthorn Alley. It was boarded up. It was, officially, awaiting sale as part of Ashe's disputed estate. The sale had been pending for 9 years and showed no sign of resolution. It was not, however, empty. A crossing sweeper boy named Albert, 12 years old, who worked the corner near the Craven Theatre, had been noticing things for months. Lights in the upper windows on certain nights. Carriages, good carriages, private carriages with crests on their doors that he couldn't quite make out in the dark, arriving after midnight and departing before dawn. Men in evening dress entering through a side door that should have been nailed shut. Albert, as crossing sweeper boys often were, was largely invisible to the class of men he was observing. He grew bolder. One evening in November, he crept close enough to the side entrance to hear voices from inside. He could not make out words. He could make out the tone, formal, measured, the kind of voice used at official proceedings. And he could smell something, an animal smell, like the cattle market but wrong, sweeter. The way meat smells when it has been kept too warm for too long. He told his mother. His mother told him to mind his own business and be grateful he had a corner to sweep. But Albert, who was sharp enough to know that what he had seen was worth something to someone, found his way to the offices of a newspaper journalist named Percival Hatch, who was already making inquiries into the events on Blackthorn Alley. Hatch investigated the Craven Theatre over several weeks. He identified 3 of the carriage crests through a contact at the College of Arms. The crests belonged to families of considerable standing, a baronetcy, a member of the judiciary, a name connected to the Home Office. He documented 7 nocturnal visits in a 6-week period. He was preparing to publish when his editor received a letter. Hatch never knew what the letter said, but the following morning his editor told him, with evident discomfort, that the Craven Theatre story would not be running. When pressed, the editor said only that they had been advised. Hatch continued his investigation independently. He disappeared in December of 1889. His notes, found in a lodging house in Stepney, describe a theater that had been modified inside with extraordinary thoroughness. The seating had been removed from the stalls. The stage had been reinforced with new timber. The orchestra pit had been deepened, considerably deepened, and at the bottom of it, too far below stage level for any musical purpose, there was a door. Where the door led, Hatch's notes do not say. The final entry reads only, "I now understand what the symbol means. I should not have gone down." Sound, the out-of-tune instrument plays alone for a moment. Then that too stops. Chapter 9, The Man with No Face. Sound, the fog thickening, a footstep, a pause, another footstep, always just behind you. There are 12 recorded witness statements, spanning the period from September 1888 to February 1889, describing the same figure. He is tall. The estimates vary 5 feet 11, 6 feet, 6 feet 2, but all place him above average height for the period and all note the same quality of stillness. He does not shift his weight. He does not turn his head. He stands as if posture requires no effort, as if he has forgotten what fatigue means. He wears dark clothing, a coat, a hat. The clothing is described variously as well cut and as worn and as impossible to characterize, as if witnesses' eyes could not agree on what they were seeing. His hands, on the 2 occasions witnesses noted them, are described as pale, very pale, the paleness of a body that has not seen sunlight in a long time. And his face. 11 of the 12 witnesses describe his face the same way. They cannot see it. Not obscured by shadow, not hidden behind a collar or a scarf, simply absent, as if the space where a face should be is occupied by something that light declines to illuminate. One witness, a former sailor who had rounded the Cape and was not easily frightened, said, "It weren't dark where he stood. There were a lamp not 6 feet away. Everything around him was lit clear, but his face, it weren't in shadow. It were like shadow was what his face was made of." The 12th witness is different. The 12th witness claims to have seen the figure's face. The 12th witness is a woman named Rose Tanner, a street seller of 43 years, who encountered the figure at the western entrance to Blackthorn Alley on the night of January 8, 1889. She was close enough, she said, to smell him. He smelled, in her words, like the inside of a church that's been locked up too long. She saw his face. She would not describe it. She was interviewed 3 times by investigators with varying degrees of authority and persistence. She declined, consistently, to say what she had seen. She said only this, and she said it once, and she never repeated it. "He weren't looking at the street. He weren't looking at me. He were looking at something I couldn't see, something he was very pleased about. And I knew, looking at him, that whatever it was, it had taken him a very, very long time to get it." Rose Tanner moved to Glasgow in the spring of 1889. She lived to 91. She never returned to London. Sound, a single footstep, much closer than before, and then nothing. Chapter 10, The Ripper Copycat. Sound, a newspaper boy calling the morning headlines. The words blur into each other. A crowd gathering on a corner. On the 3rd of March, 1889, a body was found in Mitre Square. The wounds were precise, methodical. The method was, to any officer who had worked the Whitechapel murders of the previous autumn, immediately and sickeningly recognizable. The newspapers, restrained by editors who had received certain communications from certain offices, did not draw the connection publicly. But within the Metropolitan Police, the comparison was unavoidable and the implications were impossible. The Ripper murders had stopped in November 1888. The prevailing theory, never proven, never disproven, was that the killer had died or been imprisoned for some unrelated offense, or had simply stopped. Killers sometimes did. The cessation was taken with enormous relief as evidence that the worst was over. This March murder did not fit that theory. The investigator assigned to the case, a detective inspector named Graves, cross-referenced the wound patterns against the documented post-mortem reports from the 1888 murders. The correlation was not approximate. It was exact, not the work of someone who had studied the murders and attempted to replicate them. The technique was identical in ways that could not be known from newspaper accounts, in ways that had been deliberately withheld from public reporting, in ways that only the original killer could have known. Graves made a note in his personal diary that evening, a diary not found until 1970 when his granddaughter cleared his estate. The note read, "Either the same man, or the same hands, which is not the same thing." He did not elaborate. The rest of the diary's entries for March and April 1889 are in a handwriting progressively less steady than what came before, as if Graves was not sleeping well. The final entry, dated April 29th, consists of a single line. The tunnel goes all the way through. The March 1889 murder was never formally connected to the Ripper case. It was eventually attributed to an unknown individual, and the file was closed. Detective Inspector Graves retired from the force in May 1889. The note about the tunnel would not be understood for another 80 years. Sound of file drawer closing, a lock turning, papers being shuffled into a sealed envelope. Chapter 11. The Tunnel Beneath Whitechapel. Sound, a match striking in absolute darkness. The small orange light reveals a low brick ceiling, a stone floor, and stretching away in both directions, a tunnel with no visible end. The tunnels were not in themselves a secret. Victorian London was threaded with underground passages of every description: sewers, cable conduits, old plague pits, the remnants of medieval crypts, the maintenance tunnels of the nascent underground railway system. Tunnels were mundane. Tunnels were engineering. The city had been building them for 800 years. What was found beneath Blackthorn Alley in the spring of 1889 was not mundane. The entrance was discovered by accident, by a sewer worker named George Pell, who was investigating a blockage in a lateral pipe running beneath Osborne Street. He found, behind a section of brickwork that had been loosened and receded so many times the mortar had been replaced with a black adhesive substance he could not identify, a passage running perpendicular to the sewer, running, by his estimate, directly below the eastern end of Blackthorn Alley. Pell, a careful man who wrote careful reports, noted the passage and reported it to his supervisor. The supervisor reported it upward. The upward chain of reporting produced, within 48 hours, an unusually rapid response. Two men from an office Pell's supervisor could not precisely identify who arrived, inspected the passage, thanked Pell for his diligence, and informed him that the passage was a legacy infrastructure remnant that would be dealt with in due course. Pell was reassigned to a different district the following week. But Pell, a careful man, had already gone back alone. He had brought a better lantern, and he had gone further into the passage than he had dared the first time. 60 feet in, the passage opened into a chamber. The chamber was approximately 30 feet in diameter. The floor was stone, not brick, and the stone was old, much older than the Victorian infrastructure surrounding it. Old enough, Pell thought, to predate the current city entirely. The chamber contained 3 things. The first was furniture. A long stone table, stone benches on either side. the remains of what appeared to be oil lamps in rusted iron brackets on the walls. The second was instruments, laid out on the stone table with the precision of a surgical theater, an array of tools that combined the vocabulary of a surgeon's kit with objects that Pell could not categorize. Blades of unusual shape, vessels of dark glass, things that seemed designed to measure or contain or channel, but whose exact purpose he could not determine. The third was the walls. The walls of the chamber, floor to ceiling, were covered in the symbol, not carved this time, painted, in something dark and old that had long since dried to a deep brown, painted so densely that in places the individual symbols merged into a single continuous texture, as if the room itself were skinned in the mark. The painting, estimated from the layering of material, had been added to over an extremely long period. Centuries, the expert who eventually examined Pell's rubbing would suggest. Centuries of the same symbol, added by different hands, in the same dark paint. At the center of the chamber's ceiling, directly above the stone table, was a shaft leading upward. Pell did not climb it. He said later that he had wanted to and that something had stopped him. Not fear, precisely. More the sense that the shaft was occupied, that something was already using it, that if he put his head into that shaft and looked up, whatever was at the top would look down and the meeting would not be to his advantage. The shaft, based on the chamber's position, led directly up through the foundations of the eastern wall of Blackthorn Alley, the warm wall. Sound something moving in the shaft above, slow, deliberate, beginning to descend. Chapter 12, The Final Confession. Sound a hospital ward at night, breathing, the distant rattle of a medicine cart, rain against a high window. Inspector Raymond Croft was dying. He had known it since January, when the physicians at Bart's had told him, with the combination of precision and useless tact that characterizes the medical profession, that the deterioration of his lungs was advanced beyond intervention. He had perhaps 3 months. He should put his affairs in order. His affairs, as it turned out, included a confession. He wrote it in February, in a hand that had lost none of its neatness despite everything, in a series of letters addressed to a former colleague who had himself retired from the force and was living quietly in Essex. The letters were not mailed. They were found, after Croft's death in March, in a locked tin box under his bed at the rooming house in Bermondsey where he had spent his final months. The colleague, receiving the box as specified in Croft's will, read the letters once and then, according to his own account, sat in his garden for a very long time without speaking. He eventually forwarded the letters to a journalist, not Hatch, who was already gone, but a younger man who had been making inquiries of his own. The letters describe what Croft had learned during his 11 years on the Whitechapel beat, not all at once, gradually, in the way that a man who is paying close attention to something assembles a picture over time, piece by piece, each piece small enough to dismiss on its own, impossible to dismiss once enough of them have accumulated. The letters describe a network, not a conspiracy in the theatrical sense, not a cabal meeting in secret rooms swearing oaths in candlelight, though perhaps, Croft allowed, there had been elements of that too. Rather, a web of mutual interest and mutual protection connecting men of influence across several decades and several institutions. The judiciary, the Home Office, certain positions within the church, certain positions within the Metropolitan Police itself. Men who were connected, most of them loosely and at considerable remove, to a set of activities centered on Whitechapel, on Blackthorn Alley, on practices that had been ongoing in one form or another since at least the 18th century. They had not commissioned the Ripper murders, Croft was careful to say. He did not believe any human agency had directed Jack the Ripper, but they had known who Jack the Ripper was, or had strong reason to believe they did, and they had chosen not to act on that knowledge, not from carelessness, from calculation. The murders and the fear they generated served a purpose. A city terrified of its own streets was a city that looked inward, that locked its doors, that did not ask questions about what was happening in tunnels beneath its feet. Fear, Croft wrote, has always been the best key for the doors that powerful men need opened. He named no names. He said simply that the names were in the red ledger, that the red ledger had not been destroyed, and that it was currently in the possession of a person he described only as a woman who was there at the beginning and understands more than any of us. He did not say who she was. He did not say where she could be found. He died on the 14th of March, 1889. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia. The physician who signed the death certificate did so without requesting a post-mortem examination, which was unusual but not unprecedented, and which no one at the time thought to question. Sound: a letter being folded, an envelope sealed, a tin box locked, and from somewhere outside the hospital window, far away, barely audible, the sound of footsteps on wet cobblestones. Chapter 13. The street still waits. Sound: silence. The rain has stopped. Only the hiss of the gas lamp remains. The investigators who pursued the truth of Blackthorn Alley did not retire peacefully. 3 died within the year. 1 was committed to Bethlehem Royal Hospital, where he spent his remaining days drawing the same symbol, over and over, on every surface he could reach, with whatever implement came to hand, never speaking, never sleeping more than an hour at a time, his eyes carrying the particular quality of attention of a man looking at something no one else in the room can see. The last man, the journalist Percival Hatch, disappeared on a December evening in 1889 while walking, supposedly, to his editor's office. The route should not have taken him through Blackthorn Alley. No one has ever explained why it did. Jack the Ripper was never identified. The murders stopped. The files were sealed. The men who sealed them are long dead. Blackthorn Alley still stands. It still has no sign. The black wall at its eastern end is still wet to the touch no matter the weather. The symbols on the brickwork have mostly been worn smooth by more than a century of London weather and London neglect mostly, but not entirely. If you know where to look and you look in the right light, at the right angle, you can still trace the outline of 1 or 2 of them with your finger. The chamber beneath the alley was documented, sealed, and sealed again. After each of the 3 occasions, it has been rediscovered by infrastructure workers over the past 100 years. The reports from each discovery are classified under separate file numbers with no cross-referencing, which may be coincidence and may be deliberate, and which means that each team of investigators has begun from scratch, has made the same discoveries, has experienced the same outcomes. The outcomes are consistent. None of the investigators continue in their roles beyond 6 months of the discovery. Their reasons for departure vary. Their silence afterward does not. The warm wall has been tested twice with modern equipment, in 1971 and 2003. Both tests confirmed a persistent thermal anomaly inconsistent with any adjacent heat source. Both test reports recommend further investigation. Neither recommendation has been acted upon. And the disappearances continue, quiet, unremarked. Every few years someone goes into the eastern end of Blackthorn Alley and does not come out. The pattern is not consistent enough to constitute a formal series. The intervals are irregular, the victims demographically varied, the circumstances different enough that no single investigating officer has ever had cause to connect more than 2. It requires a very long view to see the pattern. The kind of long view that requires you to look at records stretching back not years, but generations. The kind of long view that requires you to ask not who is taking these people, but what. Because Jack the Ripper, whatever he was not the cause of Blackthorn Alley. He was a symptom. The alley was old before he found it. It will be old long after the last person who remembers his name is gone. Whatever lives in the warm wall and moves through the shaft and has been waiting patiently in the chamber beneath since before this city was a city. It was not summoned by a man with a blade in the autumn of 1888. It was simply attended to, fed, maintained, the way a great fire must be maintained if it is to keep burning. The lamp still burns white. On some nights, standing at the mouth of the alley, you can hear breathing. Not the wind, not the city. Breathing, patient, old. The kind that belongs to something that has been waiting a very long time and has absolutely no reason to hurry. We do not know what Jack the Ripper was. We do not know if the word was even applies. But we know this much. The street is still there. And it is still midnight. And behind you, very softly, the footsteps have started again. The true horror is not only Jack the Ripper, but the possibility that Victorian London itself created monsters. Blackthorn Alley, Whitechapel, 1888. Chapter 14, The Archivist of Spitalfields. Sound, a grandfather clock striking 3, the soft crackle of a coal fire, rainwater dripping from the brim of a hat placed carefully beside the door. In February of 1926, nearly 4 decades after the final confirmed events surrounding Blackthorn Alley, a woman named Edith Vale arrived in London carrying a leather case chained to her wrist. No official record exists of her birth. No census lists her name. And yet, over the next 11 years, her presence appears quietly in the margins of documents connected to Whitechapel, library registrations, restricted archive requests, church visitation ledgers, property inquiries concerning buildings bordering Osborne Street. Never enough to attract attention, always enough to suggest purpose. Edith Vale was, according to the single surviving account written by a clerk at the British Museum, a woman of unusual composure, middle-aged perhaps, though difficult to judge. She dressed plainly, spoke softly, never removed her gloves indoors. And she asked questions no ordinary historian would think to ask. She requested access to sealed police transfers from 1889. She requested coroner's reports associated with the Whitechapel murders. And most disturbingly, she requested architectural records concerning underground modifications beneath Blackthorn Alley dating back to the 18th century. The clerk later wrote that Miss Vale seemed disappointed by how incomplete the records were. As though, he noted, she already knew what ought to have been there. By spring, Edith Vale had rented a narrow house in Spitalfields. Neighbors rarely saw visitors, but they heard things. Typewriter keys late at night. Heavy trunks being dragged across the floor. And once, only once, the unmistakable sound of someone screaming underground. The police were called. 2 constables arrived. They found Miss Vale calm, composed, sitting beside the fireplace with tea already prepared, as though she had been expecting them. She apologized for the disturbance and explained that a shelf in the cellar had collapsed. The younger constable accepted the explanation immediately. The older constable did not, because while speaking to her, he noticed something peculiar. The chain attached to her wrist did not secure a handbag. It secured the leather case. And from inside the case, very faintly, came the sound of pages turning. Sound paper shifting slowly inside a locked container, no human hand touching it. The constable asked what was inside. Miss Vale looked at him for a very long time before answering. A record, she said, of debts. The older constable would later tell his wife that the moment she spoke, the room felt colder by several degrees. Not emotionally cold, literally cold. Their breath had fogged faintly in the candlelight. He never returned to the house. In October of 1927, Edith Vale vanished. The landlord entered the property after neighbors complained of a smell coming from below the floorboards. The smell was not decay. It was seawater. The cellar had flooded despite no broken pipe being found. The water was black, opaque, and unnaturally warm. Floating at its surface were hundreds of loose pages covered in names written in faded ink. Every page had been torn from the same red leather ledger. The case chain to Edith Vale's wrist was gone. And on the cellar wall, written in fresh chalk from floor to ceiling over and over again, were the same 6 words. It knows when it is observed. Sound chalk snapping, silence, then a wet footstep somewhere below the flooded cellar floor. Chapter 15, The Last Descent. Sound modern electrical hum, camera static, the distant rumble of underground trains beneath London. The final confirmed investigation into Blackthorn Alley began in November of 2003. Officially, the project concerned thermal irregularities beneath a redevelopment zone near Whitechapel. Unofficially, 3 members of the survey team had independently discovered references to the alley while reviewing sealed municipal archives. One of them was Dr. Nathan Harrow, a structural engineer specializing in subterranean infrastructure failures. Harrow was not interested in ghost stories. He believed in pressure gradients, fault lines, steam leakage, electrical anomalies. He did not believe in haunted alleys. That confidence lasted until the 4th night underground. The survey team had entered through a maintenance shaft beneath a condemned warehouse east of Osborne Street. They carried thermal imaging cameras, digital mapping equipment, ground-penetrating radar, and enough lighting to illuminate every inch of tunnel ahead. The equipment failed one piece at a time. First the radios, then the digital compasses. Then the thermal cameras began showing impossible readings. Not heat signatures, shapes, human-shaped absences colder than the surrounding air. 5 of them at first, then 9, then too many for the software to count. Sound distorted radio static, a voice trying to speak through interference. At 2:13 a.m., the team located the chamber described in George Pell's 1889 report. The room matched perfectly. Stone table, painted walls, the shaft in the ceiling. But something had changed. The symbols were wet. Not painted wet. Fresh. As though someone or something had renewed them recently. Dr. Harrow approached the center table, while another surveyor scanned the ceiling shaft. The surveyor suddenly froze. He whispered something. No one understood him at first. Then he repeated it louder. There's someone up there. The shaft was over 30 feet high. There should have been nothing visible at that distance. But the surveyor insisted someone was standing at the top, looking down. The team raised a floodlight toward the shaft. And for one brief second, the chamber illuminated fully. The recording recovered afterward lasts exactly 4 frames before corruption overtakes the file. But those 4 frames show enough. A face, not descending from the shaft, growing out of it, as though the darkness itself had begun forming features. Eyes first, then a mouth opening far too wide. Then movement. Fast movement. The footage cuts violently. What happened next survives only through fragmented testimony from the 2 surviving members of the expedition. They described footsteps circling them in total darkness, breathing directly beside their ears, hands touching them from impossible angles, and voices speaking from inside the walls in dozens of overlapping whispers. One survivor claimed the symbols on the walls were moving. Not metaphorically, actually moving, crawling slowly across the stone like living things. Dr. Harrow was the last person seen alive inside the chamber. According to the final surviving audio transmission, his voice remained calm until the very end. Then came 12 seconds of silence. Then Harrow spoke one final sentence. It isn't under the city. A pause. Breathing. Closer now. And then, the city is under it. Sound deafening static, then total silence. The tunnel entrance collapsed 21 minutes later. No cause was identified. Official reports attributed the deaths to structural instability and methane exposure. The surviving footage was sealed. The thermal scans disappeared from municipal archives 3 weeks later. And Blackthorn Alley remained. Waiting. Final ending: the white lamp. Sound: midnight rain beginning again. Slow footsteps approaching over wet stone. Tonight, if you walk through Whitechapel long enough, you may eventually find yourself standing near Osborne Street without remembering exactly how you arrived there. London does that sometimes. The streets shift when no one is looking. The fog thickens. And somewhere ahead, beyond the sleeping city, a white gas lamp burns against the darkness. Not yellow. White. You tell yourself it is only another alley. Only another forgotten corner of an old city. But then you notice something strange. The street around you is silent. No traffic. No voices. No wind. And the deeper silence beneath it, the silence underneath London itself, feels less like emptiness and more like listening. The alley waits ahead. 114 yards long. The black wall glistening softly at the far end. And if you stand very still, you may hear breathing. Not behind you. Not ahead of you. Below you. Deep beneath the cobblestones. Slow. Ancient. Patient. As though something enormous is asleep beneath the city. Something that has fed for centuries. Something tended carefully by killers and scholars and frightened men in dark offices who understood one terrible truth. The murders were never random. The disappearances were never accidental. And Jack the Ripper was never hunting alone. Sound: footsteps approaching rapidly through fog. You turn. At the mouth of Blackthorn Alley, beneath the white lamp, a tall figure stands motionless in the rain. No face. No shadow. Only darkness where a man should be. Watching. Waiting. And very slowly, it begins to walk toward you. Sound: one final footstep directly beside the listener. Blackthorn Alley is still there. And something inside it is still awake.